My name is Thea O'Neill, and I'm 32 years old. The dining room smelled like sage and roasted turkey, candles flickering along the center of the table my mother had set with the good china she only brought out twice a year. 14 chairs were filled that Thanksgiving, cousins and aunts and my father's old college roommate who never missed a holiday, and I sat near the end of the table next to my sister Wren, who had flown in from her hospital residency looking effortlessly polished in a cream sweater that probably cost more than my rent. I had come straight from a double shift at the diner, my feet still aching in my sneakers even though I'd changed into a dress in my car in the parking lot, and I told myself it didn't matter. That today was about family, not about who wore what or who did what for a living. My father stood up when the turkey had been carved and the wine had been poured, tapping his glass with a fork the way he always did before his yearly toast, and the room quieted, all those familiar faces turning toward him with warm, expectant smiles. He cleared his throat, grinning in that easy way he had, the way that made people laugh before he even said anything. "I just want to say how proud I am of my 2 daughters," he said, raising his glass toward Wren first, his voice thick with pride. "One daughter is a doctor," he said, and the table murmured approval, glasses lifting toward her. "And the other one is a waitress," he added, chuckling, gesturing loosely toward me like I was a punchline he'd been saving all day. 14 people laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not exactly, but an easy, comfortable laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from people who don't realize they're laughing at someone instead of with them. I laughed too, because that's what you do. Because making a scene at Thanksgiving over a joke felt small and petty, and because I had heard some version of that joke every year since Wren got into medical school, and for a few minutes, I almost believed I'd let it go. Then my mother stood, her wine glass catching the candlelight, and she looked at Wren with the kind of open, unguarded adoration that used to make my chest ache when I was younger, and didn't understand why I never seemed to earn that same look. "To my brilliant daughter," my mother said, her voice already a little thick with pride and wine, "who's going to save lives one day. We are so, so lucky to have her." The table lifted their glasses again, a soft chorus of "to Wren" rippling around the room, and I watched my mother's eyes shine as she looked at her, and I realized, sitting there in my one nice dress with my server shoes still tucked under the table, that in 32 years, I could not remember a single toast that had ever been raised to me, not when I graduated, not when I got my first apartment on my own, not when I picked up a second job so I could help pay for my father's knee surgery 2 years ago. A fact nobody at that table seemed to remember or care about. Something in me went very still, the way the air goes still right before a storm rolls in, quiet and heavy and waiting. I set my fork down. I felt Wren glance at me sideways, an apology already forming in her eyes, because she had never asked for this. She had never wanted to be held up as the good daughter while I got laughed at as the punchline. But that didn't change what our parents had just done in front of everyone we knew. I thought about every double shift, every night I'd come home smelling like fryer oil and someone else's spilled wine, every time I had smiled through a rude customer because I needed that tip to make rent, every single time I had swallowed the words I wanted to say because it was a holiday, because it was easier, because I didn't want to be the difficult one. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor, and the sound seemed to too across the whole table, cutting through the chatter until every single face turned toward me, curious, a little confused, waiting to see what I would do. My mother lowered her glass slowly. My father's easy smile faltered just slightly at the edges. I stood there for a moment in the candlelight in my one good dress, with 32 years of quiet, swallowed pride rising up in my throat, and I finally opened my mouth to speak. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, cutting clean through the quiet that had settled over the table. "I'd like to say something too, if that's all right." My father's fork hovered halfway to his mouth. My mother's smile stayed frozen in place, the kind of smile people wear when they sense something is about to go wrong but haven't figured out what yet. I looked around the table at all those familiar faces, my aunts and cousins and my father's old roommate, all of them waiting, and I felt something settle inside me, calm and certain, like I had finally stopped holding my breath after years of not realizing I'd been holding it. "Dad called me the waitress a minute ago," I said. "And everyone laughed. And I laughed too, because I always do. But I want you all to know what that waitress has actually been doing this year." I turned toward my father, who was still holding his wine glass, his knuckles a little white around the stem. "That waitress picked up double shifts for 6 months so she could help pay for your knee surgery, Dad, because your insurance didn't cover the physical therapy you needed. That waitress drove 2 hours each way twice a week to sit with you in recovery because Mom had her book club and Ren had her residency schedule." I saw my father's jaw tighten, his eyes dropping briefly to the tablecloth. "That waitress also puts $300 a month into a savings account for Mom's retirement fund, because Mom mentioned once, almost a year ago, that she was worried she hadn't saved enough, and I didn't want her to worry anymore." The room had gone completely silent, except for the soft flicker of the candles, and someone's fork accidentally clinking against a plate. My mother's hand had come up to cover her mouth, her eyes suddenly glassy, and I could see her doing the math in her head, connecting all the small unexplained deposits she'd probably noticed but never asked about. "I'm not saying this to embarrass anyone," I continued, my voice softening but not wavering. "And I'm certainly not saying it to take anything away from Ren, because she has worked incredibly hard, and she deserves every bit of pride you have for her." I glanced at my sister, who was looking up at me with an expression somewhere between guilt and fierce protectiveness, like she wanted to stand up right along beside me. "But I am so tired of being the punchline at this table. I am tired of being introduced as the waitress, like that's the entire sum of who I am. Like the work I do to support this family and pay my own bills and show up for every single one of you doesn't count for anything just because I don't have a medical degree hanging on my wall." My father set his wine glass down slowly, the color draining from his face as the weight of the joke he'd made without thinking finally seemed to land on him. "Thea," he started, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier easy humor. I know you didn't mean it to hurt me," I said gently, because it was true, and because I wasn't interested in making him the villain of this story, only in making sure I was never again the punchline of it. "But intentions don't erase impact, Dad. I've smiled through that joke for years because I didn't want to make a scene, and today I realized that swallowing it every single time hasn't protected anyone. It's just taught me that my feelings are less important than everyone else's laughter." My mother stood up then, coming around the table without a word, and wrapped her arms around me, her shoulders shaking slightly as she held on, whispering an apology against my hair that I felt more than heard. By the time dessert was served, something in that dining room had shifted permanently. My father raised his glass one more time before the pumpkin pie was cut, his voice rough with an emotion I rarely saw from him, and this time he said my name first. "To Thea," he said, looking directly at my face, "who has been quietly holding this family together in ways I clearly haven't appreciated enough. I'm sorry it took this long for me to say it." 14. Glasses lifted toward me that night, and for the first time in 32 years, I let myself simply receive it, instead of shrinking away from the attention, instead of deflecting with a joke of my own. Ren squeezed my hand under the table, and later, as we cleared the plates together, she told me she'd been waiting years for someone to finally say what she'd never had the courage to say herself. I drove home that night with the radio off, the quiet in the car feeling different than it usually did. Lighter somehow, like I had set something down that I'd been carrying for far too long. I didn't fix everything that happened at that table in one conversation, and I know some old habits die harder than others, but I proved something to myself that night that mattered more than any toast ever could, that my voice deserved to be heard at that table just as much as anyone else's, medical degree or not. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever felt like the family joke instead of the family pride, hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told.